you know, where I wanted to start with this is how life could change. This was my piece that I published over at HartmannReport.com on Saturday. And it's titled, "Life Will Dramatically Change Under Brutal American Oligarchy." And my point is that the Trump presidency gave us kind of a perspective, an insight, a short view, as it were, a glimpse of what American life could be like under a totally authoritarian government. He never got us there, but he sure was trying. You know, selectively deciding which press can come to a White House press conference and calling out the press and you know, all these kind of things. And we're seeing this right now played out in governments around the world where authoritarian strongmen, countries that at one point were democracies, authoritarian strongmen have risen up and largely taken over. I would say that Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Netanyahu in Israel, if he can use this war to pull off, you know, enhancing his political power and keeping himself out of prison, probably falls in that category. Certainly Erdogan in Turkey, Putin in Russia, Orban in Hungary, Modi in India, and Duda in Poland. All of these guys increasingly, you know, authoritarian. And the point is that authoritarianism, when you still have a semi-functioning democracy, as is the case with all these countries, that kind of authoritarianism is really just a midpoint. This is not how a government can function over the long term. This is always a transitional phase. You either have a functioning democracy or you have essentially a fascist state. And the way you make that transition is through the path of authoritarianism. And I'm referring to that authoritarianism in the article that I wrote Saturday for HartmannReport.com as oligarchy. And in fact, this is my most recent book, The Hidden History of American Oligarchy, lays this out. You know, how this happens, how it works, where it comes from. And this was the sort of thing that the founders of this country, the framers of the Constitution, thought they could protect us from. And it's why they had checks and balances, and why there's two branches of Congress, and, you know, all these things. But back in 1911, a political philosopher by the name of Robert Michels published a book on political parties. And in that book, he created or invented or came up with the phrase, the iron law of oligarchy, his idea that oligarchy was the inevitable result of a democracy if the democracy failed to put into place strong guardrails to protect itself from being overwhelmed by the very rich. That in every single case, according to Robert Michels back in 1911, in every single case where a country had gone from being a democracy to being basically what today we would call fascist, what he was referring to as oligarchy, and what I refer to as oligarchy in my most recent book, in every single case, the path to that oligarchy or fascist state was through authoritarianism, and that path always was paved by very wealthy people, first gaining control of the economy through something very much like monopoly, which is what we have in the United States. Name an industry that's not dominated by fewer than 5 companies. You can't do it. Right? I mean, you know, whether it's, I mean, even obscure things like, you know, arts and crafts, it's, you know, airplane manufacturing, flying, you know, transportation. Pick a, you know, restaurant, pick an industry, and that's what you see. And this corruption of politics happened when the guardrails were taken off in 1976 and 78 by the Supreme Court. And, you know, in their Buckley and Bellotti decisions. And then, of course, they doubled down on that in 2010 with Citizens United. And there's a series of steps that you see in these oligarchic movements as they're moving toward fascism. crushing the rights of women while glorifying a macho ethic. We heard today that the Supreme Court is now going to decide whether, it's okay to basically ban abortion in the United States. Crony capitalism, making the few rich and screwing everybody else. Crushing union efforts, legalizing and widespread promulgation of a police state, basically, that uses selective enforcement of the law. The way that, essentially the way America polices black people. These are all the hallmarks, and this is just the beginning of it. I'll get into a few more on the other side, of that process that we are in and we have to acknowledge. As I was saying, I want to get back to this and just this parts of this list. I mentioned crushing the rights of women, crony capitalism, crushing union efforts, legalizing surveillance, and the sub part of that legalizing surveillance is that the political elites get away with crimes that the average person would go to jail for. Repression of religious minorities is another piece of this. The weaponization of religion as an agent of state power is another piece of this. The marginalization and demonization of minorities, particularly racial and gender-based minorities, is part of this. I mentioned selective enforcement of the laws, so you never know if you're going to be the target of state violence. Example, how America polices black people. Seizures of the courts, so that selectively enforced laws and regulations are used to maintain the power of oligarchs and assuage the insecurities of basically their base, their followers. A huge gap. One of the other characteristics of this transition between democracy and oligarchy or fascism is a huge gap between the rich and poor. And this is often accompanied by an explosion of homelessness. And again, you go back and you look at that list of countries I just laid out, and you'll find most of these things are characteristic of every one of them. Civilian paramilitaries who terrorize the population, including the political opposition. Liz Cheney over the weekend made the comment that she knew that there were a number of her Republican colleagues who wanted to vote to impeach Donald Trump the second time around, when it was just irrefutable. And they didn't do it because they feared for their lives. That was her phrase. They feared for their lives. I mean, this is how fascism rises to power. You have the racialization of powerlessness and poverty. Again, another characteristic of a country that is making the transition from democracy into full-blown oligarchic fascism. A brutal grassroots response to those who object to selective poverty, typically leading to the marginalization or even the outright assassination of movement leaders, as happened to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and others. A false form of nationalism. And this is a real key. I mean, the Republican Party is like totally here on this. This was the key to Mussolini's rise to power in the early 1920s. I think it was 24 that Mussolini rose to power in Italy, maybe 1925. Glorifying this mythical past, explicitly covering up the past crimes and failings of the country, and positioning the new oligarchy that this political movement is bringing along as the pinnacle of political evolution. And the corruption of the political process, which we see Republicans doing right now. We now have 3 or 4 states that have passed laws that say that whoever wins the election is no longer up to the voters and up to the professional bean counters who keep track of the elections, but it's now up to the Republicans in their legislatures. So, that's what we have, this corruption of the political process. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. So, as I was saying, and just to highlight this transition, there is a transitional process that governments go through from being functioning democracies to being essentially fascist oligarchies. And in the middle of that process is the rise of a pseudo-nationalism, a new authoritarianism. One of the hallmarks of, and we're seeing this we're seeing it played out in the United States right now, hugely, in real time. We have already seen it play out in countries like Hungary, and Russia and the Philippines and Brazil. You know, they're a little farther along than we are in most cases. Other countries, well, for example, in France right now, you're seeing the rise of Marine Le Pen, who is basically, you know, France's Donald Trump, and there's a very good chance she's going to win the next election, and then France goes down, right? And to a large extent, this is this is always driven, at least according to Robert Michaels back in 1911, and I've seen nothing to contradict that over all these years. I read about this in The Hidden History of American Oligarchy at some length, that this corruption of the political process, deciding which votes get counted and which don't, so that the whole voting process becomes a charade. We now have 4 states that have instituted this, made it law, where the Republican legislatures get to decide which votes will be counted and which votes will be ignored. This false nationalism that celebrates a mythical past and papers over the past failings of the country, which is another way of preventing future, you know, positive movement of the country. That is a key to it. We're seeing that right now in the cancel culture happening over on the Republican Party, canceling Liz Cheney, rewriting what happened on January 6th. We've had now a number of Republican members of Congress going, oh, it was just a normal day. You know, you would have just thought it was tourists visiting the Capitol. Right. Civilian paramilitaries who terrorize the populace, which are, you know, obviously we're seeing here, but also terrorize the political class. I think one of the most alarming pieces of news that I saw this week was Liz Cheney on TV saying that she knew that, or perhaps it was in an interview with the Washington Post. In any case, you can find a link to it in my op-ed here over at HartmanReport.com, that she knew that there were Republicans in Congress who were going to who wanted to vote to impeach Donald Trump the second time around, when it was just completely obvious what he had done and how impeachable it was, who did not vote to impeach him because they, quote, feared for their lives. That's Hitler's brown shirts. That's just short of the Night of the Long Knives, which was when the Nazis started actually assassinating their political opponents. The seizure of the courts so that you could selectively enforce the laws, another dimension of this, a huge and growing gap between the rich and the poor that's actually encouraged and maintained by the government, by government policy. Now, this is all kind of the bad news, everything that I've laid out for you. The good news is that the Biden administration, and you know, again, frankly, I'm shocked by this, because I just, you know, during the primaries, I was not a fan of Joe Biden. I wanted Bernie or Elizabeth Warren. But he has risen to the cause. You know, I mean, nobody thought Lyndon Johnson would become who Lyndon Johnson was. Very few people thought that Franklin Roosevelt would become who he became. And now Joe Biden is doing it. He is showing people that a small d democratic government, and a big D democratic government for that matter, can work. See, the first step in moving a country from democracy to fascistic oligarchy, the first step is causing the people to no longer trust their government, to believe that their government can't function, can't do things. And that first step was taken by Ronald Reagan in his inaugural address, January 20th, 1981, when he said, government is not the solution to our problems, government is the cause of our problems. That's the first step toward fascism. And the Republican Party has been pushing this as hard as they possibly can. If Biden can get through his American Jobs Plan and his American Families Plan, and if he can push these through via reconciliation, there's a good chance he'll do it, then maybe we can slow down the Republican rush to fascism. And obviously, if we can pass the For the People Act, H.R. 1, which is going to require blowing up the filibuster, then we can stop fascism dead in its tracks, or at least 3/4 of it.